Boardroom Bound, Episode 64, The 9 Risks Facing the Boardroom in the Next Decade, with Kathleen Camilli.
How was it to be in the boardroom? It was a learning curve like anything else. I took some courses to get started. The public accounting firms all have free webinars and classes you can take in board governance.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder that you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. Today's episode is sponsored by the Private Directors Association. PDA empowers directors to lead with confidence in the boardroom. As one of the recognized authorities on leading boardroom practices, PDA helps today's directors be well prepared for tomorrow's challenges. I'm part of the leadership team for the Boston chapter, and I'm very excited that on Wednesday, March 25th, we're providing a free virtual meeting offering board-relevant guidance to help companies confront the coronavirus and mitigate its business impact. Amid the fear, uncertainty, and disruption created by the coronavirus, boards can make critical contributions to help their organizations withstand and recover from this escalating crisis. Their collective experience with past crises and ability to take a long-term view can offer management very helpful perspectives during this time. During this virtual meeting, we will discuss several key actions that boards should consider taking right now. I hope you'll join us, and you can sign up for this free event at pdaboston.com. In today's episode, we'll be speaking with Kathleen Camilli, who is a former Federal Reserve-trained Wall Street economist now serving in the boardroom. Her expertise is in helping CEOs navigate changes in the economy. She serves on 2 public company boards in the U.S. and Canada, one on the Stock Exchange of New York and the other on the Toronto Exchange, as well as a private cryptoasset exchange in Chicago. In today's show, we'll explore a number of interesting topics using Kathleen's board career as a case study. So this is an example of someone who's excelling in her own career, and because of that, a CEO at another firm that she worked with recommended her for her first board role. And then one of the service companies that often helps a board, think accounting firms or law firms, saw how she acted in a board, knew her background expertise, recommended her to another company they worked with who needed that type of position filled. And from there, it grows and blossoms. So we've heard on this show about being expert at what you do, and networking naturally comes from that. We'll also hear from Kathleen about learning. Every board director's job is to learn not only about their company and their industry, but also opportunities for the company to grow and develop, and also the opportunities to overcome challenges that are existing. We'll hear about how Kathleen approaches that as a lifelong learner and the guidance she will recommend for all of us to position ourselves for success. So let's jump into the show. Well, Kathleen Camilli, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Happy to be here, Dr. Alexander Lowry.
Well, delighted to have you for all of our listeners today, because this is going to be a great case study in some ways about how someone goes from being excellent at their what I'll call the day job and what they were trained to do and built a career in the board space and grown and developed. And now that you've been on 3 different listed stock exchanges with companies, plus done some of the advisory work on the side as well, I think you're a great example that we can talk through about what that looks and feels like, and also sort of setting expectations for people. You and I were talking beforehand that it's not quite always the glamour that some people think it is. We've got a lot to cover today.
Yes, that's for sure.
Well, I would love to just start, if you could give us a bit more about your background and what you're doing today in your career to set the scene.
Sure. So I'm a Federal Reserve-trained economist. I started my career in the early 1980s, and I spent 25 years on Wall Street. And then in the early 2000s, after 9/11, I did a pivot in my career. It wasn't completely intentional, but I got on my first public company board of directors when I was 42 years old. And I did not anticipate ever getting on a board. It was not something I had planned for. But a CEO who knew me very well and knew of my credentials on Wall Street asked me to be on his board. And it turned out to be an eye-opening experience because I served with the treasurer of MIT on that board, and I learned a lot about board governance and boards in general, and how I could be a valuable contributor. So it was a few years later that I decided I could do public speaking and board work full time, and so I made a pivot in my career away from being a traditional economist in a Wall Street firm or in an asset management firm to being a full-time director.
And I was looking at your bio on LinkedIn beforehand, and I'm seeing in parallel that. So that first role is when you're at Credit Suisse. So you're working in a high-profile company name, got your first public company board role. I imagine that was a springboard, right? So you talked about that at the beginning. You have this brand and this reputation as a Federal Reserve trained economist who worked on Wall Street, and now you're building up that board career on the side. That is going to grow and take shape over time. It's easy to look back now and see, oh, this is how it started and it happened. But talk us through what that's like maybe in your first board meeting. You're talking about the learning curve that you went through.
Sure. So, again, as I said, I didn't anticipate being asked to ever be on a public company board. And this board was it was a NASDAQ-listed bank. The name of the bank was Mass Bank. It was a billion-dollar bank located in the state of Massachusetts. And I was the third woman to join the board, which was already a big plus given the state of boardrooms in the United States today. Mm-hmm. So I was the third woman joining. And as I said, I was serving on the ALCO committee, the Asset Liability Committee, with the treasurer of MIT. And the job of that committee is to not only oversee the external accountant, auditor auditing the bank, but also to look at the bank's portfolio and how it reacts to interest rates and changes in the business cycle. So the first board seat that I got lent itself very well to my past career. And how was it to be in the boardroom? It was a learning curve. I mean, it was a learning curve like anything else. I took some courses to get started. There's a lot of the public accounting firms all have free webinars and classes you can take in board governance. And then you can join organizations like the National Association of Corporate Directors, which I belong to now. I'm a governance fellow. But that came quite a few years later down the road because on my first board seat, I was still working full time. So it was something that I was doing very part time. And
after you'd had that first company, and I know you helped take it off of the public market by selling itself because you predicted the economy was going to go south. So good on you for you. How did it go from being that first opportunity to building your network, expanding it to position yourself for the other board roles that followed?
Okay, so that's a very good question because we didn't anticipate selling the bank. What happened was in 2007, I could see that the economy was rolling over into recession. And we happened to be having an ALCO meeting, and the CEO asked me, so what do you think's happening? I said, I think we've already entered recession. And that was in November of 2007. And, much to my surprise, they decided to sell the bank. And we were very lucky because they worked on the deal most of 2008. And the deal closed 2 days before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt.
Oh, wow.
With all the shareholders intact at $45 a share. So we were amazingly lucky, and I felt grateful to have helped them because many of these shareholders were local depositors, and this was their bank. So it was a great thing. And I didn't really plan for another board seat, to tell you the truth. I was still busy with my consulting firm, doing public speaking and traveling. And so I didn't know how my second board seat would come about. And so I just busied myself. And this is what you have to do in board world. You have to network, which I did. I joined the appropriate organizations, as I mentioned to you, the National Association of Corporate Directors. I live in New York City, so I joined the New York chapter. I started attending the meetings. But then I needed something else to do on the side because we were in the middle of a financial crisis. Mm-hmm. So I started trading. I started teaching myself how to trade. And I was trading the markets during the crisis. So my second board seat didn't come along till 2011. So that was 3 years after. And it came about through the law firm, actually, that had seen me in the boardroom, in my first boardroom, and they saw how I conducted myself and saw my level of expertise. And so another board, that's often how board seats come about once you're in the boardroom, is through the people who service boards, which would be the public accounting firms and law firms and outside consultants. So that's how I landed my second board seat, which is a board I currently sit on now, which is the UniFirst Corporation, New York Stock Exchange listed, headquartered in Wilmington, Massachusetts.
And I think that's a wonderful story for our listeners, because you were basically just doing your job and doing it excellently. And people who were there interacting with, you weren't trying to network with them. You were just doing your job. And because they saw the standard and knew a need that your skill set fit elsewhere, they recommended you.
That's correct. And I want to emphasize that for all your listeners, that you really need to stand out at what you do. So regardless of whether you're a CEO, a COO, a CTO, a CISO, you need to stand out, be outstanding at what you do, whatever your skill set is, because that's how you get recognized.
And in some ways, that is a general principle. It absolutely holds true. But I imagine the boardroom is different today from when you walked into your very first meeting to the most recent meeting you had, in some ways, because the world is changing and the world is shifting from social media to artificial intelligence, digital transformation. So do you feel like the guidance you would give someone in terms of what to be excellent in changes, or it's still just wherever you are in your job and that'll be okay? How do you think about that?
So I think that you do have to be excellent. You have, first of all, you have to have a skill set, because remember, boards are populated by people with certain skill sets. So you have to have a skill set that's desirable for a board. This is why so often CEOs are in the C-suite, is because they have the skill set. Legal people are also in the C-suite because they have the skill set. Human resources directors are on boards because they have a skill set that's needed. The same with chief technology officers. So it's very common sense. These days now, with the baby boomer cohort being so large and people having moved out of their professional careers, people are looking to join boards. And they think that it's an easy thing to just hop on. In fact, the membership of the National Association of Corporate Directors has doubled over the 10 years that I've been a member. It's actually doubled.
Wow.
Because of so many people wanting to be on boards.
We actually just recorded the episode with Peter Gleason, who runs the NACD, and he said it's up to 21,000 directors now.
They're up to 21,000 directors now, and this includes people on private, public, and not-for-profit boards. So it's a very competitive landscape now. Very, very competitive. And also keep in mind that after the Sarbanes-Oxley law was passed in the early 2000s, that was one new layer of regulation that was affecting the boardroom. And then after the financial crisis with the Dodd-Frank Act, that was a whole nother new set of rules affecting the boardroom. And now, in the last 2 years, given all the events related to corporate culture and #MeToo, and ESG issues, this is another wave of change in the boardroom. So you definitely have to be on your toes. You have to absolutely love learning, be a lifelong learner, because it is it's a tough job to be in the boardroom and to be on your toes. People used to use it. Think of the board as a career. It's something they did at the end of their career after they left their day job. But now people have become full-time directors, and the SEC will not let anyone sit on more than 4 public company boards because they look upon it as a very important role and something that you do on a full-time basis.
And overboarding is such a popular discussion now with activists, and I would argue that they wouldn't even want you getting close to the 4 because, a board meeting is going to have probably over 1,000 pages of document you're going to read, and depending on the type of industry, and there might be a lot of stuff in between. For example, if you do a lot of M&A, right, but might be other things as well. So it is definitely growing and changing. Now, as you look forward, we talked about more about before we started on the show of this, and I know we'll cover it later about lifelong learning and how you're seeing things going. We've talked about that big transformation, right? ESG, Me Too. We've seen lots of examples in the news of people who've been asleep at the wheel and the boards have not been paying attention closely. So when you're on the boards of these companies today, you're not only thinking about what am I struggling with today to make sure we got our grips around, but you're trying to get ahead of what's coming in the future. When you look ahead, what do you worry about? What's keeping you up at night?
Well, I just came from a chapter meeting in New York where we talked about what keeps us up at night. And so let's talk about digital transformation because most companies are being affected by the changes in the way they sell their products, who they sell them to, and what channels that they sell them over. And in addition to that, this is what I'm speaking about. There is basically the impact of Amazon. But then in addition to that, they're thinking about the seamlessness with which transactions can take place, and moving from laptop computers in-house to the cloud and to this is part of the whole digital transformation, how we link our systems and how we talk to our customers and how social media has affected all of that. So, if you don't have a technology background, there's a big push today to bring digital directors onto the board, and that is specifically somebody who comes from the technology industry. But it's really not necessary. I mean, it's a luxury to have someone with that background, and those people are in very high demand. But it's really up to every single board member, whether or not you have a technology background, to learn. And just mentioning once again the organization, the National Association of Corporate Directors, you are constantly getting new credits. You're constantly going to school and getting credits to keep your skills up to date, and there's plenty of ways to do that with an organization like NACD. Going out to the Computer and Electronics Show in Las Vegas every year, going to visits to Silicon Valley to visit firms. So there's many ways to do that.
And Peter Gleason was telling us the story about the electronics show and all the amazing stuff they do of bringing the best booths and the right technology. And directors have to stay up to speed on it. And it's more than just that. So I imagine you do a lot of, we talk about lifelong learning, a lot of work on your own, reading books, trying to get up to speed, talking to the right people. What are the books that you're reading around these topics today?
So the one that I just finished, which I think is excellent, is written by Brian Stafford. He's the CEO of Diligent Boards. Diligent Boards is a software that many boardrooms used for the directors to log on and get the board books. We happen to use it on my Canadian board. So the book that he and Dottie Schildlinger wrote is called Governance in the Digital Age, a guide for the modern corporate board director. And then the other book that I'm just in the midst of is on AI, and this one's called The Artificial Intelligence Imperative, a Practical Roadmap for Business, and this is by Dr. Anastasia Lauterbach and another NACD member, Andrea Bonin-Blanc. Excellent book about AI and what it means for your company.
Well, I appreciate those recommendations, and my Twitter feed is filled with all things board, and Brian's advertisement seems to be all over it. So it's great to hear a good recommendation from someone who's read it and finished it. I'll have to pick that up now.
Good.
As you think about the boards that you're on, so we've talked about you got to your second board seat, and that's not the only one. You've referenced some other ones that you're on. Give us more of a sense for how it grew and developed. So we heard that the law firm was the one who recommended you for your second board seat. This has become more of a portfolio for you now. You also have advisory boards. Can you give us a sense for how that grew and developed and the other opportunities came up for you?
Right. So when I joined my NYSE board, that was another steep learning curve because I had not sat on a New York Stock Exchange board. So in addition to joining the National Association of Corporate Directors, I started to get to branch out, learn more about the industry, and join some other groups. I subscribed to Directors and Boards magazine. I started attending the board summits that are hosted by the NYSE governance group because I was on an NYSE board. So you're continuing to learn all the time. And then, of course, I joined that company is UniFirst, which is the second largest uniform provider in the United States. And I had to learn about the industry. So you have to start reading to learn, not just about corporate governance, because, of course, you always want to have top-notch skills, but you have to learn about the industry. And in order to do that, you have to be hands-on. You have to be able to, do site visits at the company and learn as much as you can and talk to senior management. So it's a learning process. And then, then what happens next? I've never had great amount of success going out to look for a board. So that means even though I might have met with recruiters, it's never resulted in me coming top of mind on a recruiter's short list. I've always had better luck just being good at what I do and also talking about it with people like you, or talking about it on LinkedIn, or writing about it and being quoted in the paper. I've always been more successful that way. My third public company board seat did come through a recruiter because it was a very specific search in Canada for a female director. So that was, and that was through networking. But again, these things are. I can't stress enough to your listener audience that it takes. It's not like a job search at all. It's about doing what you do well and just staying the course, and then doing the networking, and then kind of sitting there and waiting. That's the only way I can really describe it. And you better have, if you have a lot of time on your hands, you better have a lot of hobbies or a lot of other things to do.
I like that. And I imagine for some people, let's take that point you just made, where do your job really well. So you were an economist, you had to build a reputation for that. Excellent. The networking part, as you're preparing for that, though, there's probably essential board member skills that people should pick up. I know we talked about NACD is a great place to learn some of that, but you've also talked about you're reading about different skills that you personally need to grow and develop. If you were talking to our audience of someone who's an aspiring board member for a few years from now, how would you recommend other ways that they begin to think, this is how I could pick up the skills. This is where I should focus?
Okay, so besides NACD, you can get a person to coach you, and I've had a number of coaches over the course of my career, including my last coach who was specifically a board coach. So I would recommend that. A board coach can help you with your board bio, because a resume will not do for board search. You need a specific board bio, and it's written in a certain way. So that's one thing that I would recommend. This is for somebody like me coming to the board world as an economist. I would imagine that for CEOs, this is something that's not really necessary because they're already in the C-suite.
Right. And I think that's a good point for our audience. So this is all tailored to your individual times and needs about where you are in your career. You've talked about someone who's perhaps in the C-suite and perhaps exiting and thinking about what they'll do next. I've already been there, versus someone who is preparing to move into the C-suite. And you made that point earlier that there are certain tech roles now that are so highly desirable as a skill set onto a board. They might not be in the C-suite yet, but have a fast track into the board role, and for different reasons. So all of this has to be adjusted to the individual. But we also talked about something today of there's a difference between someone getting on their first board seat versus someone who's become perhaps a professional director and has a portfolio of opportunities, being on, say, multiple public companies, or perhaps some advisory roles in addition to some full board of director roles. And those people are also positioning themselves in a little bit of a different way and perhaps doing some different activities because they've finished all of the early stuff. Now that you're in that sort of category, what is your recommendation for people saying, great, I did that first one, now I want to take it to the next level?
Right. So I would advise you to get involved advising companies. So one of my passions happens to be female entrepreneurs. Why? Because I am a female entrepreneur myself. I started a consulting firm in 2004, and then I started another firm, which was a technology software company, which didn't go very far. But I learned a lot, and I'm very sympathetic to women entrepreneurs and what they have to deal with. So I mentor people, one of the first people I mentored was a woman in the fintech space who was developing a software product here in New York called Tactile Finance. From there, that led to Springboard, which is a group of female advisors all with branches all over the country advising female entrepreneurs. I also, back in 2013-14, had a special interest in the energy industry. So I networked my way through NACD and Women Corporate Directors into the energy space, and I ended up mentoring a woman who's founded a company called Pink Petro, which is located in Houston. I've met a lot of people in the energy field through that organization and being on a 12-person advisory board to mentor her and be an advisor to her, particularly with respect to raising capital. And so that's follow your interests. I have tremendous interest in the energy industry as an economist because energy affects every single business cycle that I've ever lived through. My father also happened to be a polymer chemist at Exxon, so I grew up with energy. I would just say follow your interests. I have not landed on an energy board yet, and I suspect that's only because there are people with engineering credentials or geology credentials or other credentials that may be higher than me on the pecking order. But that doesn't mean I'm not still hopeful.
And I know you're also eager for another fintech company as well, if an opportunity would open up there.
Well, yes, actually one of those did just come up in the last year. I'm on a private board in Chicago of a crypto asset exchange. There are many of them around the world, and I was approached along with two other very senior women to join this board. And it's called CCX, and I'm on the board of one of the subsidiaries. And I joined that board. I was actually approached through LinkedIn Recruiter for that board. And so that's the reason I decided to join, was because I wanted to learn about that space, and there's no better way to learn than to be on a board, because you better know what you're doing if you're sitting on the board.
Well, I think you've also had another great nugget there. So clearly your profile, if someone goes to look at it, we'll have a link in the show notes, is all about boards at this point, right? There's a lot of great information that shows your expertise and your background, and I imagine a lot of that pops, and that's the information that resonates with the recruiter. LinkedIn is a wonderful tool for people who are looking for to find people to be on boards, and clearly you have done that well and intentionally. So in addition to having the board bio, you need to have your presence also in different places, whether it's Twitter or LinkedIn, to represent that.
That's correct. And it's easy for me, given that when I was a Wall Street economist, I spent 20 years being on television on a regular basis and being quoted in the press. So it's very easy for me. I have many, many friends in the media. It's very easy for me to go to LinkedIn. I'm a voracious reader, so it's easy for me to post and to comment, which I do. And I often see, recruiters coming to look at my profile. So I highly advise your listeners to become vocal, to stand out, and to learn and to post judiciously, but to post with with an eye towards stating how you would conduct yourself on a board. I don't think anyone who reads my posts has any doubt of how I would conduct myself on their board.
I think that's a great way to explain it. So one of our prior episodes, Matt Craven explained you need to move to a position of authority. So you're seen as an expert on a certain topic. Clearly a post is a great way to share some of that information, do it consistently. And I really love the way you've explained it there of I am representing my true self, and they will get a sense of who I am to see whether I'm a good fit. Not that you're trying to advertise, but in a sense you are.
Yeah, but you're doing it genuinely. You're doing it absolutely genuinely because people who serve in an independent director role on a public company board are representing the shareholders and the stakeholders, and it is their job to ask tough questions and to have and to be knowledgeable, and as you mentioned, to be an authority. So you might as well speak up.
I like that. And I think you might have just answered the question I was going to have. And as we begin to wrap up, I wondered what parting advice that you would have for new and aspiring board members. That was an amazing nugget. I'm not sure if you've got another one to match.
Oh my goodness, I don't know either. I would say, again, I'll circle back to the beginning. Be exceptional at what you do. Whatever that skill set is you have that you think lends itself to being on a board, be exceptional at it. Be outstanding. You should have won awards in your field. You should be recognized in magazines. Be excellent at it. That's my and be a lifelong learner and just love learning and love meeting people and love love business. That's another thing. Love business.
I think that's a great message that we can all resonate with, because the opportunity of being a board director is a privilege and a huge responsibility, and we all need to do it well. And we were delighted to have you on the show today, Kathleen, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. And if people wanted to follow up and contact you, what would be the best way for them to be in touch?
So you can contact me on LinkedIn, and I believe on the bottom of my LinkedIn profile is my email address. So either way would be totally fine. Happy to connect with you. I connect with lots of people.
Well, I know we're connected on LinkedIn, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And thank you so much for being part of the podcast and helping all of our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Pleasure to be here with you today, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Kathleen Camilli. It was wonderful hearing her frank and honest story of how she started her board career, which she had never anticipated, never desired, and how that has turned into a whole portfolio board career role. And this is someone who was excellent in her first job, excellent in her first board role, excellent in her second board role, and the snowball effect happened. But also during all of that time, who's been a lifelong learner, is learning to hone her craft and to network with the right people, learn the skill sets to cover what the issues are, not only today, but what's coming down the line. These are stories and lessons that we can all take forward to help ourselves. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will get links to the resources we talked about in today's show, and there were many of them. And if you enjoyed this episode or any other episode of the podcast, I would so appreciate it if you'd open iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or wherever you're listening to this and take just 30 seconds to leave an honest rating and review. This helps us get out word about the show. I'd also encourage you to stay tuned and subscribe, because every week we're working hard to put out top quality content for you. And thanks for joining me in this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.